Hello and welcome to the show Beyond the Journal, where we discuss social media, digital education, and current controversies in cancer and medicine. I'm Dr. Jack West, Associate Professor in Medical Oncology at the City of Hope Cancer Center in the Los Angeles area. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Charu Agarwal, who is the Leslie M. Heisler Associate Professor of Lung Cancer Excellence at the University of Pennsylvania's Abramson Cancer Center in Philadelphia. Hey, Charu.
Hi, Jack, and today we are pleased to welcome Dr. Erika Hamilton, who's the Director of Breast and Gynecologic Research, or Research Program, I should say, at the Sarah Cannon Research Institute. Welcome, Erika.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we would like to start off by asking you about clinical research. Sarah Cannon has historically been known for accelerated clinical trial conduct, and it's really a well-oiled machine. You all start up clinical trials really fast, really quickly. Many of us struggled during COVID. Many institutions have now continued to struggle because in the post-virtual environment, it's difficult to retain people to actually conduct clinical trials. How was the effect of COVID for you? Did you have to pause trials? And how have you, researched since or over the past few months?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting topic. We did have challenges during COVID. I think everyone had challenges during COVID. And I kind of saw it as a little bit into different phases, right? Initially, it was actually, the safety of getting people to the clinic and what hospital offerings are there going to be, et cetera. And now that we're almost 2 years in, it's almost changed to this less COVID itself and patients, but maybe a little bit more staffing and retention and hiring and this kind of change in the workforce that we've seen. We're pretty lucky. Our parent company, HCA, is based here in Nashville, where I'm based. And so during the height of COVID, they said, well, we're kind of doing three things right now. We're doing COVID care, we're doing ER care, and we're doing cancer care. And I think that was really important because it set the priorities that we weren't going to have trouble getting interventional radiology biopsies for study, that no one was going to tell us that we couldn't accrue during that time, et cetera. And so we really did kind of choose to make it a priority. I felt bad for a lot of cancer patients there initially. We got several patients in transfer. I think all of us got several patients where their institution kind of couldn't keep things rolling. And you imagine how tough COVID was for most people. But if you're in this vulnerable situation where you're faced with metastatic cancer and suddenly, access to your therapy is in question, that's a really tough spot to be in.
Absolutely. Did any of the trials kind of in flight or in development adapt in a way of making it more flexible for people to get labs done remotely and telemedicine? Telemedicine kind of sprang onto the scene out of necessity, cobbled together in March and April of 2020, and then we kind of got a little better at it, and we have seen that evolve, at least in routine non-trial based practice, but the clinical trial system is extremely regulated, kind of hyper regulated, and it seems like that would be a real opportunity to also reduce some of the disparities so that you can actually get more people who might not live within 30 or 45 minutes of the cancer center to be able to participate in trials if they don't need to come in every 4 days.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Jack. Initially we saw some trials even kind of pausing. Most didn't. We were lucky that we kind of, carry a pretty broad menu just because of the volume of patients we kind of have coming through the door because we're linked to a large private practice. And so even when, one or two trials in an area would close, we tended to still have an offering there. But you're right. I think we talk about this a lot about patients' actual access to clinical trials, and COVID heightened that for a variety of reasons. But I think that's still an issue. The majority of people in America don't live within 1 hour of a clinical trial center. And that's really what we're trying to do with Sarah Cannon, is be the trial center that's kind of in your backyard or in your city, right? But it was a little bit of a lag. There were some patients that couldn't make it there that frequently. We took deviations for a couple of things. We would get labs checked locally instead of here, and that wasn't quite per protocol. But then I think a lot of pharma caught up with that. We had the ability to do telemedicine, particularly on the day 15s or not the beginning of the cycle, et cetera. The ability to do local labs and have those count, et cetera. So I would really love post-COVID to take some of this stuff with us and then also really build upon it. How much really needs to be done at the actual trial institution to keep patients safe, or how much can be done locally in collaboration with their local physician in laboratory.
Can I just follow up with you on that same theme, but not specifically talking about clinical trials, which are more rigid and there's a lot more involved with that. I would say just about everything that you mentioned about how we approach clinical trials, how much does this really need to be done here versus, is it such a big thing to have the labs drawn close to home or a video-based day 15? I think we applied that same concept to our off-protocol treatment of patients in telemedicine and found that, this is perfectly good for some of our patients. And my sense, and obviously, Charu and I are both thoracic oncologists, and there's a lot of high acuity. I think some patients, I suspect many with breast cancer, are doing very well for a long period of time and could be very amenable to telemedicine. So how was that experience for you, and where would you see it going after it's not a born of necessity anymore?
Yeah, I think to answer this question, first, I kind of have to caveat that I see patients across the gamut. So I see standard of care patients, I see phase 2-3 patients, but I also see a lot of patients within our phase 1 unit. And so my answer, depending on where I'm sitting, is very different. So, absolutely. I have a lot of patients that are on endocrine therapy and a CDK4/6 inhibitor that realistically don't need to come and see me every month, right? I can accomplish that with the telemedicine, a symptom check, and a local CBC, really. We are kind of one of the community practices that are doing CAR T, as well as a lot of bispecifics. So I feel very strongly and differently about that, there are certain patients that really need to be in a clinical trial institution for certain infusions.
And we're not seeing CAR T by telemedicine anytime soon.
Correct. But you're right. I think there are a lot of circumstances where, we can really lessen the burden on patients to seek their cancer care.
So Erika, speaking about clinical trials, you perform clinical trials for breast cancer and certain gynecologic diseases. This is basically your clinical niche, your research niche. How has being an investigator on clinical trials changed over the years for you as more and more drugs are being introduced into the ecosystem of clinical trial research and many new approvals are coming through?
Yeah, maybe a couple general themes. I think antibody drug conjugates has been a huge one, right? It wasn't too long ago that TDM1 was really our first antibody drug conjugate, and now we have multiple more and a lot coming, not only in HER2 positive disease, but certainly data coming out with sacituzumab and hormone receptor positive, a lot of the DXD, B7H3s, et cetera. There's a lot coming down the pike. I'm a big antibody drug conjugate fan. Not all of them are great. So it definitely depends on your linker and your payload. We've seen amazing antibody drug conjugates, and we've seen ones that were not so great. But I remain very excited about that class. And then, I think we've seen a little bit of shift towards more orals, actually. And we've seen that even in our phase 1 unit. Certainly CDK4/6 inhibitors, but, the oral PI3 kinase inhibitors, SHP2 inhibitors, that type of thing. So, it's an interesting time to be in oncology because there is a lot changing and there are certainly so many drugs coming every year.
It is really exciting. I think that we in lung cancer have been gratified that over the last 20 years it's gone from carbotaxol for everybody to much more individualized, much more complex. But one of the other things that we do struggle with is the threshold to adopt a new treatment, and frankly, I think that we are struggling with it now in lung cancer a little differently than breast cancer. I think breast cancer as a field has been more open to changing practice based on disease-free survival and questions and potentially controversy about absolute versus relative benefit, a 3% DFS at 10 years, and the kind of things that in lung cancer, I think we would historically at least just say, oh, no, it's overall survival or don't talk to me, because, that's just what our goal is, particularly in a curative setting. But breast cancer is incredibly longitudinal and from as the view of an outsider, often inclined to accept much more for marginal gains. And I'd love to get your perspective on that, particularly as somebody who works in a few different oncology settings, and whether cost to patients or to society is or should be a factor at all for things that may not move the needle on overall survival.
Those aren't easy questions, Jack.
Well, you can take the rest of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. Breast cancer is a little bit different. I'm certainly not going to say it's a chronic disease, right? These patients certainly die from their cancer, but it is a unique situation that, most patients go on to get multiple lines of therapy after their initial trial. Yeah. And so, for example, trials like CDK4/6 inhibitors, et cetera, they go on to get that later. And so a lot of times, really being able to show overall survival when our drug approvals are so quick, and patients that are then subsequently, gaining access, et cetera, becomes a little bit difficult. I also think that breast cancer, because, we're not really just treating people with 2 lines and, unfortunately, most of the time they're not in shape to receive more. That doesn't happen as frequently in breast cancer. Is that, we kind of have been a field where we've made these incremental successes, and any one doesn't look so huge, but it's kind of like a staircase. All of a sudden you're on the 2nd floor and you're like, how did we get here? Well, it was 9 steps along the way that none of them seemed huge, but added up, it made a real difference. Right. So, I mean, I think it is a little bit different from disease to disease. If I want to contrast that with ovarian, certainly much worse outcomes in ovarian. We still haven't even perfected adjuvant treatment of ovarian. The majority of patients that get Taxol carboplatin relapse. And so there, I think the magnitude of jumps are a little bit bigger. And so in some ways in breast cancer, the absolute benefit is smaller because we're already doing pretty well, if that makes sense.
No, that makes great sense. I mean, it's hard to show big incremental benefits when the outcomes are excellent. Yeah.
Right. And the other thing is, breast cancer is common, right? I mean, about 70% are hormone receptor positive, and, the remaining 30% divided amongst triple negative and HER2. But, this really affects a lot of people, right? I mean, 1 in 8 women, will face breast cancer in their lifetime. So, it's tough because these incremental benefits really are, pretty significant to a lot of people.
Absolutely. And, we've discussed this before in terms of DFS versus OS, but the points that you made today are so well taken. A lot of our audience, focuses on early or career development, or they're early on in their careers. And, breast cancer is a huge field. And we just talked about how quickly it's changing, actually very, very fast. What are your thoughts about subspecialization in this field? Can you just be known for, or can you develop your career just thinking about HER2 positive breast cancer that only is localized and not metastatic? Or did you think about that when you were thinking of this as a career?
Yeah, I think you certainly can, right? There are numerous people that I can think of that really have, a niche in, a subset of breast cancer, whether it's, immune for triple negative or antibody drug conjugates or, HER2, et cetera. And I think a lot of that's dependent on the institution you're at and kind of how you and your colleagues kind of carve that out a bit. So, at Sarah Cannon, we are a community practice. We're trying to do great research, and I think we succeed with that. So I end up seeing, a wider birth of breast cancer than maybe I would if I was at an academic institution and had 12 other colleagues that only saw breast cancer. But absolutely, I mean, I think the field is large enough and there's so much drug development in breast cancer that you really can carve out a niche as a triple negative immunotherapy expert, for example.
Can we, let's shift to social media, which I think is a big part of, well, I mean, it's part of our personal lives, it's part of our professional lives. How much of your use of it is do you think to teach, to learn, and you're part of a big cancer center? How much do you encourage junior people coming up to use Twitter, for instance, or maybe other platforms as a way to keep up with things or share your work?
Yeah, so I consider myself kind of a social media newbie, actually. It was only several years ago that I really kind of found my way on Twitter. And it was actually at the urging of our CEO, Deanna Smith. We were at a dinner and she said, are you on Twitter? And I said, no, I can't figure out how to use that stuff, and Instagram. I'm on Facebook and that's about it. And she's like, you can do this. You need to make an account. And, I got on there and I actually really liked it. I think Twitter, medical oncology has grown, disease specific chats. I participate as often as I can in a patient advocate chat, on Monday night on Twitter. And it's been incredibly helpful during the pandemic when we're not necessarily seeing our colleagues at meetings, when we get data and, normally you're kind of wanting to see how everyone else is digesting it too. And we haven't been getting that. So, I think Twitter is a great forum to share ideas, to hear ideas of people that you maybe don't normally talk to, the pharmacist or someone else that, is in a different domain that's not in your clinic every day. And so I think it's been really, really helpful, actually. I still use Facebook, which is predominantly for my personal life. Twitter, I tend to use more for my professional life, but you'll see it's COVID in my Twitter feed and occasional children-related stuff too. We're all people first.
Yeah.
No, that's great. And I think the point that you raised about staying connected during COVID has been huge. Tell us about your involvement with OncoAlert and how do you use Twitter as an educational channel as well?
Yeah, when, Gil initially approached me, to be part of it, he's like, you tweet about breast cancer. Would you do this? And I'm like, so, what does it entail? And he's like, well, we're just making a loose collection of people and we're going to amplify it and try to kind of keep people, up to date on education. And I was kind of like, okay, yeah, it sounds fine, but it's kind of amazing how much it's grown and, how much people that are maybe, private practice doctors that don't get to attend a lot of meetings and that, going onto Twitter and seeing what other people thought the highlights for the meeting, it's a very efficient way for them to digest what's practice changing without having to devote 5 days sitting in an auditorium, kind of trying to figure that out for themselves. So I think it has been great. It's also really increased my communication with our international colleagues that I don't have the opportunity to see as frequently. And, for time zone, also don't have the opportunity to speak on the phone with as frequently. So I think it's made a big world seem a little bit smaller. And, for the absolute most part, conversations have been really collegial. People, putting out one idea saying, hey, I disagree. I see where you're coming from, but I really feel this. I've loved participating in those conversations, and I really think it makes all of us grow.
I think it's really interesting how I believe that we all become products of, the place where we train, and there's certain ways that's how it's done. And we can get kind of insular about thinking that that's the way everybody should be doing it. And certainly if you leave your own institution, go out into the community or a different part of the country, you can learn that, well, not everyone sees it the same way as you. And I think that that's even more so with a global population. I think it's really helpful to get the insights of places where the cost of care, the healthcare system is different, and maybe the perspectives and some of the social challenges are just different in terms of, for instance, in thoracic oncology, the adoption of adjuvant chemotherapy is pretty low in Asia, and it's much more accepted and in the U.S. Concurrent chemo and radiation for stage 3 is just not done that much in the UK for whatever reason. And I imagine that in breast cancer, there's also plenty of global differences where, it's helpful to get the insight that not everyone thinks the same as how you do it at Sarah Cannon.
Yeah, absolutely. There's plenty of those situations like you described, use of anthracyclines being a little bit more common in Europe, even for HER2, or, what we were talking about earlier, that the United States has more drugs approved than a lot of the rest of the world in breast cancer. And part of that is kind of the marginal benefit and what bar they, hold the drugs to really get them approval. So, even when new clinical trial design, when, a company is coming to you and talking about that, that weighs in, something that we aren't going to really be able to accrue in the United States because those patients kind of don't exist after standard of care, may do very well in another country. And so, if you're not talking to those people and understanding their practice patterns, that's something that you're not going to know.
Yeah, it's been great. And, use of Twitter, you talked about COVID-19 and, now vaccines and vaccination in kids. Have you used this more of a tool to also educate your followers? And have you run into any controversies or any, sort of people atting you that verb?
Of course, right? I mean, the reality is kind of the more people start following you on Twitter, the more people that are going to come out and try to attack you and send you some kind of nasty DM, right? But I never intended maybe to have a COVID following, but the reality is, whether we intended to have COVID or not, we did. And for a variety of reasons, the media, the politics, et cetera, it was really tough for people to find reliable information and then know what was reliable. And so, I did start posting about COVID and I still post about COVID because I think, no matter what field you're in, where you live, COVID has affected you in the past 2 years. It's affected your family members or your job or your kids in their schooling. And so I think we're doctors first. Maybe we're oncologists second, and we do have, a responsibility to our community. People can certainly choose to not listen to us and think we're controlled by somebody else, et cetera. But, those that do trust us, I think hearing from people that you trust that, yes, I believe in this, and yes, I'm going to vaccinate my child can go a long way for people that are on the fence.
What about, what kind of rules do you have or not have about the personal versus professional? Because I think you're right that on Facebook, you really can filter who sees what you write, and Twitter's different. And Twitter, you don't generally partition, this is for my personal followers, these are for my friends or whoever, versus this is professional. And we intermingle some personal observations, a lot of professional stuff. And sometimes some people, to very, very different degrees, will interject politics or social commentary kind of things. And is that something that, particularly because I believe you have plenty to say about COVID, which has become politicized, but I don't think that, I haven't seen much in your stream that really touches on politics more directly. So where's that line? Do you have a kind of rule about this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I do. It was really intended to be a professional platform. COVID certainly, is professional in the fact that we were all doctors. It was affecting our family. It was affecting the ability for our patients to get to clinic, et cetera. I completely agree with you that COVID has become political. I don't love the fact that it has. I don't understand why it had to be. It seems like this really should have just been a science and a public health thing, like we treat a lot of other things, but for a variety of reasons, it has become political. I don't tend to post anything about politics. I don't tend to post anything too much about my personal life, etc. I do post about kids. Sometimes I tend to not show their faces or make them identifiable in a public platform, but I made an exception for a COVID vaccine, which some people may have seen. So, I think I try to keep it professional, but I also let people know that I'm a person and have a life outside of that. And sometimes I think that helps people relate to you a little bit better.
Absolutely. And I think on that topic, you are very relatable. It's something that definitely comes through, and you're definitely one of the experts in breast cancer. We would really like to thank you for joining us today. This has been a really fun conversation. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you find your podcast content. We hope that you will subscribe and send us comments and feedback to beyondthejournalshow@gmail.com. We thank Mark Lindsay and Talking Speaker for production and distribution support. See you in a couple of weeks with our next guest.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having me. It was fun.